And that's what I'm here to kind of talk about. So in terms of turning to solutions here, I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean for a country not to solely be individualistic or solely be collectivistic, because I'll talk about how countries that solely kind of enforce collectivism also have their problems. But what does it look like to have an American value system that can combine both? Okay. The first step, and this is one that we can kind of just take in our own lives, and there's some interesting research backing this up. The first step that we can do is that we can actually, in our daily lives, teach ourselves to be as specific as possible when identifying our own culture. Okay, here's what that means. So it would be common, right, for me to say that I'm white. But there is research I'll get into in a second that says if I were to identify as more specifically what my cultural roots are, which are European American or Scottish American, that there's actually correlates with increased cultural competence and decreased prejudice. And the same thing happens in terms of just having a stronger sense of self-identity with different minority groups as well. And we've seen this in different research with people who identify as Chicano or Chicana or Latinx compared to just Hispanic. Because the term Hispanic covers people of ethnicities from Spain, Portugal, Central and South America. Whereas Chicano, right, specifically is targeting a cultural understanding of Mexican Americans. I want to get into a little bit, why is this the case? Why is it that just this simple change of identifying based on our specific cultural heritage, how can it make this difference? Well, in a separate study in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, there's a reason why reduced levels of prejudice and better intercultural relationships can happen the more specific you are in identifying what your culture is. The first and probably most important one is that we have an increased identification and connection with different cultural groups. That is, we stop seeing ourselves, like in the instance of people who are white, as an individual with no culture, but instead an individual that has a very deep and embedded cultural system that allows me to then contrast with others. And this is something that it took me way too long to figure this one out, the benefits of doing this. And thankfully, once I started to take the advice of this research, I really saw a difference. And I want to give you an example of what this looks like in action, or why this can, or how this can happen. So when I first started teaching intercultural communication, especially here at CAC, I was not used to having so many Native American students in class. I came here from Grand Canyon University in West Phoenix, predominantly kind of white Christian university. And so my first semester, there were a lot of Native Americans in the class, and I noticed I didn't feel like I was doing a good job relating to them, finding that sense of connection, making them feel really comfortable or safe, or like I understood them so that way they could participate. And one of the things I started to do is, what can I take from, say, my culture, my beliefs, my values that can allow me a pathway to build that connection? And one of the things that I started to do was I started to think about, so I'm Scottish American, I'm half Irish American, half Scottish American. My mom is the one who's Scottish American, and she's super proud of our Scottish American heritage. I started thinking about one of my favorite people in American history, which is John Muir. And for those of you who don't know, John Muir, born in Scotland, came to the United States at 10 years old, and is responsible really for the conservation of so many lands in California, whether it be Yosemite, whether it be a whole bunch of other kind of what ended up being national or state parks. And he represents in a lot of ways something interesting about these kind of history of Scottish Americans, which there are actually kind of a lot of explorers and conservationists who have Scottish Americans in their blood. And I started thinking about how, like, gosh, that, reminds me of how I love hiking, how I love the environment, things like that. And I started to do a bit more research, and I started to find parallels between kind of like how John Muir and other Scottish American type of conservationists actually have a lot of similarities to, though I wouldn't say quite as deep, but how so many different Native American cultures we know have a very different relationship with their natural environment than do, especially kind of like European American cultures. And just thinking about the influence of someone like a John Muir on my belief system of kind of environmental conservation gave me a good pathway to understand and to make connections with my Native American students who have just deep, right, culturally embedded values about environmental protection. We're seeing this right now with copper mines that are being proposed in southern Arizona. We've seen this with some of the issues with lead poisoning of water in northern Arizona with the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? We've seen different Native American groups really fight for environmental protection. And so me just taking note of my own culture, people from my culture and how they acted, what they believed, gave me that doorway to understand and to encourage discussion and connection with a culture in many ways that was different than mine that I didn't really grow up around. And I definitely still have a long ways to go. But I bring this example up to say, just thinking about your own, what we call social location, provides you the ability to think, here's where I stand, here's what I believe. This person believes this. Are there similarities in our cultural values? And if I just thought of myself as white and that's it, I probably wouldn't have been able to make that connection because there's no real cultural values. There's no real social norms that exist if you're just defined by being white. But if you're defined as European American or specifically like Irish, Scottish American, French American, German American, right? There are similarities in those cultures that allow for that connection to happen. And here's the thing. I know this, those of us that are always chanting USA, 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 we may think that we are the ultimate example of kind of how you can balance collective success with individual freedom. But I'd argue that there's actually a country that is being, in many ways, horrifically oppressed by a very, very, very collectivistic country that actually could provide us a pathway to kind of seeing how to integrate collective and individualistic values together. And the country that I'm speaking of is Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, those of you that follow foreign affairs know that boy, oh boy, has it been a crazy couple years in Hong Kong. So I want to kind of give you just an overview of how a country like Hong Kong, which is just 7.5 million people, this tiny little island that was essentially given to China from the United Kingdom in 1997. Why are they such a good example that even here in the US we can learn from? So here's how Hong Kong is doing in many ways under, unfortunately, extreme circumstances, a great job integrating individualistic and collectivistic values together. So in Hong Kong right now, there is unfortunately movements made by China to essentially get rid of the different political systems that Hong Kong has. Because in 1997, when the UK essentially handed over Hong Kong to China, it was meant to have two systems, one country was essentially the policy. But China a couple years ago tried to have an extradition bill put into place, which is if someone commits a crime in Hong Kong, they can be extradited to China, which if you were in Hong Kong, you are probably not going to like because China actually has probably the most inhumane and most strict prison system in the world. As some of you may know, they're actively engaging in concentration camps right now with the Uyghur Muslims, which is a Muslim minority group in northwestern China that are essentially being put into re-education and concentration camps right now. And so China is, I think, unfortunately, the Chinese government, I should say, is acting in a way that is collectivism run amok, right? We can see this even when the Houston Rockets general manager in the NBA, Daryl Morey, tweeted out freedom for Hong Kong. Then the Chinese government canceled all TV contracts with the NBA, essentially came out and said, how dare that this American have the right to say something about Hong Kong when Chinese unity is at stake. And so there are inclinations to try and kind of get rid of the separation between the two countries. In response, Hong Kong, the protesters there have responded by making essentially 5 demands. And you'll notice one of the demands is the right for people to democratically choose their own leaders, have the ability to uphold individual suffrage for not just kind of federal elections, but for local legislative elections as well. And one of the things that you saw even Democrats and Republicans, right? Like after China came out and the NBA kind of like waffled a little bit about like, oh, do we support Daryl Morey or do we cave into China because they spend billions of dollars in supporting the NBA? You saw both Ted Cruz and Elizabeth Warren come together, or not come together, but be on the same side and say, it is not okay that the NBA didn't stand up for Daryl Morey and individual freedom of speech. For those of you who follow politics, the idea of Ted Cruz and Elizabeth Warren being on the same page and calling out the same organization for the same reason is it's very rare. And that's because Hong Kong and the protesters are trying to instill essentially their own version of the Bill of Rights as a way to protect themselves from China. So Hong Kong, and unfortunately it's a complicated situation again that is really difficult at the moment, in part just because of the chaos of what's going on right now. But Hong Kong is standing up for individual rights. They're standing up for individual rights of their people. Here's something else that's interesting. As some of you, I shouldn't say some, as all of you unfortunately know and have been impacted by, right? There is a pandemic going on. And one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot here in the US, and we're talking about the United States response to COVID-19 compared to others, there's a lot of discussion about Germany and South Korea, steps that they have taken, that they've done successfully that we have not. But actually, they're leaving out a country that arguably has done better than anyone, which is Hong Kong. And if you look at the mortality rates of COVID-19 in Hong Kong is 7.5 million people. And as of, I believe, a week ago, 4 total deaths, which is almost incomprehensible, considering one, Hong Kong is an island that is literally right next to China, right, where this originated. We've seen how other countries nearby China have been impacted, like Japan, much more, say, than Hong Kong or Singapore was. Also, too, Hong Kong being an island, right, once it's on there, it's hard. It can essentially kind of grow and essentially kind of proliferate there. But interestingly enough, essentially what's the head of the CDC version in Hong Kong said, our population has a 99% mask usage rate, and it's not even mandatory. That 99% of the population, they estimate, wears masks out of choice, and that's been a primary factor in limiting the spread.
Hey, Barry?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I have the absolute horrible job of intervening and saying if we're going to move just a little closer to the end, we've had.
Sure. This is my last point. Yeah.
Your audience is dying to ask you questions, and so go ahead.
For sure. Yeah. No, this was literally my last point and say, look, I'll conclude by saying, this example of Hong Kong is a good demonstration of how a country can uphold individual rights and can also at the same time recognize when a group or a collection of groups have been mistreated or that impacts of policy disproportionately affect them, that they can come together and then they can do well by it. So the whole point of this today, and I'm happy to take any questions or engage in any discussion, is that hopefully not only are you now aware of your own race, your own culture, your own identity, that you start thinking about those more, but you start thinking about how can we take essentially the best of both worlds of individualism and collective identities and merge them together. Because hopefully we can all agree in a consensus that we don't want to see any more George Floyds. We don't want to see any more Breonna Taylors. We don't even want to see Antonio Arce, a 15-year-old kid in Tempe that was also shot and killed. And the more that we can see these ideologies not as separate, but as the ability to combine, the more effective and inclusive American values we can create. All right. Thank you, everyone. That's it from me. I'll be happy